Bonjour tout le monde. Good afternoon. This is a consequential moment for NATO, but also for the world. For 2 days, leaders have been focused on reinforcing NATO's strong defense of democracy. And NATO has been made stronger as we officially welcomed Finland and moved forward on Sweden's accession. Le fait d'être ici, dans un État balte, si près de la Russie, qui mène une guerre illégale contre un autre de ses voisins depuis plus de 500 jours, met en relief la très grande importance de notre défense collective. I arrived in the Baltics a day ahead of the summit and visited the Canadian Armed Forces in Latvia. While there, we made a historic announcement. We are renewing and expanding our contributions to Operation Reassurance. This includes increased financial and troop commitments that will scale up the Canadian-led NATO battle group to a brigade by 2026. Grâce à cet engagement de 2,6 milliards de dollars, on fait plus que doubler le nombre de femmes et d'hommes courageux des forces armées canadiennes qui sont déployés dans le cadre de cet effort multinational. Le Canada s'est mobilisé pour diriger cette force sur le flanc est de l'OTAN. On augmente actuellement nos effectifs parce qu'il faut absolument dissuader toute nouvelle agression de la part de la Russie. Canada has been stepping up in this region of Europe and providing significant support to Ukraine since Putin's annexation of Crimea. We've trained almost 40,000 Ukrainian military and security personnel through Operation Unifier. And I can announce today that through this operation, we're welcoming officer cadets from Ukraine to train at Royal Military College Saint-Jean for an intensive training program developed in partnership with NATO. For over 500 days now, Ukraine has withstood Russian brutalities. Putin made a grave miscalculation. He underestimated Ukrainians' courage, and he underestimated the strength of the West's solidarity and resolve. Today, the G7 came together to announce our enduring support of Ukraine's defense and launched a process to provide long-term, multi-year commitments to their security. Ukraine is fighting to make sure that borders, their own or anywhere else around the world, mean something, that might does not make right. This announcement gives Ukraine the certainty of our support as it protects its citizens, its sovereignty, and its territorial integrity. For support in the more immediate term, we will be providing drone cameras, delivering on a request Ukraine made when I visited Kyiv just a few weeks ago in June. On a également signé une entente avec d'autres alliés pour fournir une formation sur les F-16 aux forces aériennes ukrainiennes. On fournit aussi une aide à la cybersécurité et un financement supplémentaire à l'appui de l'ensemble complet de mesures d'assistance. À ce jour, le Canada a fourni plus de 8 milliards de dollars en soutien militaire, financier et humanitaire à l'Ukraine. On va soutenir le peuple ukrainien aussi longtemps qu'il le faudra, car ils se battent non seulement pour leur liberté et leur démocratie, mais aussi pour les nôtres. Lors de ma rencontre avec le président Zelensky aujourd'hui, j'ai réaffirmé encore une fois le soutien indéfectible du Canada à l'Ukraine. The world is facing many serious challenges, and we must remain ready to respond, no matter what form they take. Climate change is one of these challenges. As Canada deals with its own impacts of climate change, with ongoing wildfires across the country that are particularly bad in British Columbia today, and our thoughts go out to people in BC, as well as significant flooding in parts of Quebec, we see our friends dealing with extreme weather events too, either floods in parts of northeastern United States, fatal mudslides in Japan, and dangerous heat waves in Italy. We're all going to need to be there for each other more and more, given the impacts of climate change. As a northern country, Canada understands well how something like a warming Arctic is reshaping the security landscape. On travaille avec l'OTAN pour mettre en place le Centre d'excellence pour le changement climatique et la sécurité. Plus tôt aujourd'hui, la ministre Anand a signé le document fondateur du centre qui ouvrira ses portes à Montréal plus tard cette année. En ce moment, on doit être clair sur le fait que la politique climatique est aussi une politique de sécurité, une politique économique et une politique sociale. En effet, lorsque Poutine a tenté de militariser l'énergie, les pays européens ont commencé à réduire leur dépendance à l'égard des combustibles fossiles russes et à se tourner encore plus rapidement vers les énergies propres. Alors que nos alliés effectuent cette transition, le Canada est prêt à être le fournisseur fiable d'énergie propre dont ils auront besoin. Emerging and disruptive technologies also pose a risk to global stability, and as such, Canada has taken a leadership role in bringing together promising startups and innovators to help NATO retain its technological edge. We're doing this through contributions to the Defense Innovation Accelerator for the North Atlantic, DIANA, and we're proud that Halifax has been selected to house the North American office. We're also making investments in our defense capabilities at home. Today, we announced a $450 million investment in our fleet of minor warships and auxiliary vessels, which includes vessels deployed as a part of Operation Reassurance. This is part of the National Shipbuilding Strategy, which will help create jobs at small and medium-sized shipyards right across Canada. Le contexte de sécurité évolue rapidement à l'échelle mondiale et le Canada a réalisé des investissements transformateurs au cours des dernières années. Par exemple, on achète 88 avions de chasse F-35 et on a effectué des investissements majeurs pour améliorer considérablement les capacités canadiennes du NORAD pour soutenir la défense continentale de l'Amérique du Nord. I had the chance to speak and meet with leaders from many regions. As NATO came together to talk about Euro-Atlantic security, we also met with partners from the Indo-Pacific. We stand for the same things, including supporting Ukraine and upholding the rules-based international order everywhere, no matter which oceans your coasts touch. The work we've done together at this summit as allies and partners has made NATO an even stronger alliance. We are inextricably bound by our shared values of democracy, freedom and human rights, and the rule of law, and this bond is ironclad. We stand united in support of Ukraine and are more ready than ever to defend and deter threats to peace, stability, and prosperity. As Prime Minister, there is no greater responsibility than protecting the safety and security of Canadians. By coming together each year to work with NATO, which is the strongest defense alliance in history, Canada is safeguarding freedom and security around the world, and especially at home.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Merci, le Premier Ministre. We now have time for questions from media. One question, one follow-up each, and we will begin with Murray Brewster from CBC.
Afternoon, Prime Minister. G7 has set up a framework to assist Ukraine. What possible security guarantees can Canada provide to Ukraine and negotiate with Ukraine beyond what we're already doing?
One of the messages that we want to continue to send directly to Vladimir Putin is that Canada will be there for Ukraine alongside our other allies with as much as it takes for as long as it takes. And the core of these security guarantees is multi-year commitments to continue to be there for Ukraine. Vladimir Putin wants to wait out and grind down the alliance, grind down Ukrainians. Well, he's not going to be able to because we will be there for as long as it takes. And that's what these security assurances are all about.
I had spoken with several Ukrainian MPs ahead of this summit. They put a lot of stock in your speech to the Rada and how you could possibly sway reluctant members of NATO to issue Ukraine a direct invitation with timelines. That didn't happen. Are you disappointed that NATO didn't issue a direct invitation?
Canada has always been very clear, including a few weeks ago when I was at the Rada in Kyiv, that we unequivocally support Ukraine's accession to NATO when conditions allow. This is something that was the heart of our deliberations and, quite frankly, our conclusion, a clear path forward by NATO and a recognition that Ukraine belongs in NATO. There is much work to do over the coming years to see this war end successfully for Ukraine and have them come join us fully as part of NATO. But the solidarity of the alliance right now in demonstrating our commitment to Ukraine and the fact that we will continue to stand with them and welcome them into NATO in the future is a very important message for all Ukrainians.
Kevin Gallagher, CTV News. Prime Minister, with today's agreement with the G7 and Ukraine, how will that framework be created, basically, especially since each country seems to have its own particular bilateral agreement that will be done with Ukraine? What's the process now for Canada in that agreement?
The key to the G7 commitment is that these are security assurances that are about countries being there with Ukraine and for Ukraine for years to come. As we've always said, we will be there for Ukraine with as much as it takes for as long as it takes. And yes, even though it starts with the G7 standing together to say we are committing to these multi-year assurances, other countries are encouraged and invited to join and make their own commitments to Ukraine's long-term security. In regards to Canada, we will be discussing and working on the next steps on how to announce the details of our multi-year commitment, but part of the G7 commitment is that it will be coming.
I have a follow-up question from my colleague, John Woodward. The Canada-Ontario Housing Benefit was being used in the City of Toronto to help top up rent for low-income people, mainly refugees. That money has run out in Toronto due to extremely high rent prices, and there are instances of refugees being forced to sleep on the street, becoming homeless. How can your government assure refugees that they'll have somewhere to stay if the rental market continues to skyrocket as it is in Toronto?
Canada is a country that welcomes in people fleeing violence and persecution from all around the world. Over the past few years, we saw a spike in irregular migrants crossing between border crossings. The federal government was there with hundreds of millions of dollars in support to Quebec and Ontario primarily, but also to other parts of the country to ensure that there were capacities to support those refugees. We will continue to. We will work with municipalities and provinces on supports as necessary to make sure that Canada continues to support people who are coming to Canada.
Bonjour, Monsieur le Premier ministre. Valérie Gamache de Radio-Canada. Peut-être dans un but pédagogique, là, quand on parle de sécurité, de garantie, je comprends que c'est un engagement à long terme. Mais avez-vous un exemple de ce que le gouvernement canadien pourrait s'engager concrètement envers l'Ukraine à faire pour garantir son soutien à long terme?
Tout d'abord, la meilleure garantie de sécurité pour l'Ukraine, ça va être qu'on l'accepte au sein de l'OTAN. La garantie de sécurité qu'on offre aux membres de l'OTAN, selon l'article 5, est évidente et extrêmement ferme. C'est la façon la plus simple et la plus claire de démontrer notre engagement à défendre l'Ukraine et le fait que nous avions annoncé que l'Ukraine deviendra une partie de l'OTAN, c'est une partie de ces garanties-là. D'ici là, nous allions démontrer notre engagement continu d'appuyer l'Ukraine avec l'équipement et l'appui financier, humanitaire et autres nécessaires et militaires nécessaires pour les années à venir. Donc, Vladimir Poutine ne pourra pas tout simplement étirer cette guerre indéfiniment en espérant qu'on arrête de vouloir ou de pouvoir appuyer l'Ukraine. Ce qu'on est en train de dire avec ces assurances de sécurité, c'est que nous allons être là pendant aussi longtemps que ça prendra en tant que pays du G7, en tant que pays partenaire, jusqu'au moment où on pourrait les accepter au sein de l'OTAN.
Et puis, il y a en fait, les pays de l'OTAN s'engagent là, de verser 2 de son PIB en dépenses militaires et s'engagent aussi à avoir un plan pour le faire. La Suède vient d'être admise parmi vous et dit, ben nous, on va atteindre ce 2 %-là dès 2028. Le Canada va l'atteindre quand, ce fameux 2 %-là?
On est actuellement en processus de faire une révision de nos investissements au niveau de la défense. On est en train de planifier les années à venir. C'est certain que le monde est en train de changer. Il va falloir qu'on continue d'être là pour investir dans la défense, comme on le fait depuis des années. Au sein de l'OTAN, le Canada est le troisième pays en matière de nouveaux dollars investis depuis 2014 dans leur budget de défense. Donc, on a fait des investissements significatifs en défense et ça va continuer, entre autres, avec l'achat des avions de chasse F-88 avions de chasse dans les années à venir. Donc, nous allons continuer de faire des investissements et nous allons faire les calculs nécessaires pendant qu'on décidera des prochains investissements.
You mentioned, Prime Minister, that Canada assisted Sweden's entry, was the first country to get behind Sweden, and Sweden came in with this, with its defense spending at 1.4% of GDP, but has this plan to get to 2% by 2028. Can you make a commitment that with all of that spending that you just mentioned, Canada will get to 2% by the end of this decade, by the year 2030?
As I've said, we're undergoing a defense policy review right now. We have made significant investments in defense over the past years, whether it's the purchase of 88 F-35 fighter jets, whether it's the investments in modernizing NORAD, or further investments that we're going to continue to make. Canada has consistently demonstrated its capacity, its willingness to step up as part of NATO missions. We're doubling our troop allocation for Latvia for the enhanced forward presence that we have, and we will continue to look to invest more as necessary to keep Canadians safe and to contribute fully around the world, and we'll continue to follow up on the math.
On a different topic, the Bank of Canada raised its base lending rate to 5% today. That's the highest in over 2 decades. How concerned are you that Canadians are going to start defaulting on mortgages and other debts?
Look, this is not the news that any Canadian wanted to receive this morning. This is also a challenge that I've had conversations with fellow leaders from here in Europe and around the world on. The cost of living is a real challenge everywhere around the world, with record high inflation, with interest rates continuing to go up. People around the world are facing significant challenges. That's why in Canada, we've stepped up with targeted support for people who most need it at this moment. So last week, we delivered the grocery rebate to 11 million Canadians. Canadians in provinces where the federal pricing backstop applies will be receiving their climate check this week. And next week, the Canada Child Benefit is going to be increasing with the increases in the cost of living. On top of the housing benefit and other benefits we're delivering, we are very much focused on supporting Canadians, even as we create great jobs and grow the economy. We will continue to be there for Canadians through these difficult times as we create a brighter future for everyone. Oui. Écoutez, ce n'était pas les nouvelles que les Canadiens voulaient voir ce matin. Je comprends à quel point c'est difficile de faire face à ces accroissements des taux d'intérêt, l'inflation, les coûts de la vie. C'est des conversations d'ailleurs que j'ai eues avec d'autres homologues des chefs d'État à travers le monde, ici en Europe et ailleurs, qui font face aux mêmes défis avec l'inflation mondiale, avec les défis au niveau des coûts de la vie. Au Canada, on a mis sur pied de l'aide directe pour nos citoyens. 11 millions de Canadiens ont reçu le remboursement pour l'épicerie la semaine passée. Cette semaine, les Canadiens qui vivent dans des provinces où notre prix fédéral sur le carbone est appliqué vont recevoir leur remboursement climatique cette semaine. Et la semaine prochaine, l'allocation canadienne aux enfants va augmenter avec le coût de la vie aussi. Alors, c'est plus d'argent pour Canadiens, en plus de l'aide au logement et des autres investissements qu'on est en train de faire. Donc, oui, c'est difficile maintenant. On va continuer d'être là pour aider les gens pendant qu'on crée aussi de bons emplois, la croissance économique et un avenir prospère pour tout le monde.
Hi, Prime Minister. Sarah Ritchie with the Canadian Press. You just told us that the Alliance's commitment to human rights is ironclad. Is the use of cluster bombs a violation of human rights?
Canada is a signatory and was one of the leading countries on the convention to eliminate landmines and cluster munitions, and we continue to stand against their use.
But what about the Alliance?
Many members of the Alliance are signatories to that treaty as well and continue to stand against its use.
David Aiken, Global News. Good afternoon. Canada doesn't have the weapon systems, of course, that Ukraine wants, doesn't necessarily have all the wealth that Ukraine will need to rebuild. But it seems to me, because and you've been around a while now in the international circuit stage, you're at the NATO table, you're at the G7, at the G20, and because of that special relationship Canada and Ukraine have, you can be Ukraine's advocate, ally, and it seemed to me this morning, because Zelensky met with you first, that you might have been his advisor, counselor on how's the day been here and who do you need to see in the room. Can you talk a little bit about the value Canada had, that relationship, how it's valuable to Ukraine, and how you see yourself sort of advocating for Ukraine?
One of the challenges of being a democracy versus an autocracy or a dictatorship like Russia is that we need to bring along our citizens on investments and decisions we make on local politics or on global politics. Canada is extremely lucky to have an enormous Ukrainian diaspora, which has lucky first and foremost because they have contributed so much over the past generations to building the Canada that we know and love today, but also lucky because there is not much debate at home about standing with Ukraine with everything necessary for as long as necessary. Not every country in this alliance has an easy job, as I do, of being a steadfast supporter for Ukraine. So being able to talk with people about how to move forward on the support, re-emphasize that this is not just about supporting Ukraine, it's about supporting the principles of the UN Charter, territorial integrity, sovereignty, people's right to choose their own future. These are conversations I've had with members of the Alliance, but particularly with members of the Global South who see concerns about this war in Europe as overtaking some of their very real concerns around the world. So Canada, whether it's here at the NATO summit, whether it's at the G20 or the G7 with partners from around the world, at the Commonwealth, at the Francophonie, at the Organization of American States, at APEC, or any of the other fora we are part of around the world, we will continue to advocate that it is in all of our collective interest that the rules-based order holds, that people continue to stand up against bullies who want to make might right once again. This is a voice that Canada has always steadily had and will continue to have.
To come back to defense spending, the cynic in me thinks that we timed that announcement in Latvia so that if you got asked here about defense spending, you'll say, oh, look what we just announced in Latvia. So I'm hoping we've heard you on Latvia. You've mentioned it a lot in the last couple of days. But no prime minister, I think my friend Murray Brewster said Brian Mulroney was the last to spend 2% on defense. If you look at the fiscal reference tables, it was your dad who was the last to spend 2% on defense. Conservative or liberal, what is it about Canadian political culture that it just does not seem to be a priority for any government? Yours, it hasn't been. Wasn't for Stephen Harper's, wasn't for Paul Martin's, wasn't for John Chrétien. Why are we such free riders?
Canadian soldiers and members of the Canadian forces serving around the world in various NATO theaters or support through the UN or supports for allies are in high demand. We show up with capacities and abilities that contribute wherever we go to a larger than expected impact. We need to continue to ensure that members of the Canadian Armed Forces have the equipment, the resources, the numbers to be able to have the impact that Canadians expect us to have and that our allies from around the world expect us to have. That's why over the past years, from a low of Stephen Harper dipping below the 1% of GDP numbers, we've increased defense spending significantly. We're now behind only the US and Germany in terms of real new dollars invested in defense since 2014, according to NATO's own calculations. So we have invested significantly, and we will continue to invest even more in defense. The way of evaluating, there's lots of different math that can be applied in different ways. But the reality is Canada continues to step up, continues to invest more, and Canadians are there to contribute to the world in meaningful ways and will continue to be as we continue to increase defense spending.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Merci, le Premier ministre, and thank you to members of the media et nos médias. This will put an end to the press conference. Ça
Merci
va
tout le
mettre
monde.
fin à la point de presse.